Hello, welcome to Microfiche Microphone. I'm Micah, and on this channel we look at microfiche from the past, old newspaper articles in the public domain. We look at them with our modern eyes, our modern perspective, and see what we can learn from them. On this microfiche time capsule, we are looking at the Ladies' Home Journal from May 1901. And this article is entitled Some Remarkable Cases of Double Personality by R. Osgood Mason, M.D. Now, I'm assuming that they are talking about dissociative identity disorder, DID. Also, it says underneath, author of Telepathy and Subliminal Self, etc. Not a little skeptical of that. That's a little strange. Telepathy, huh? But it is an MD, so I'm hoping he remains clinical. I'm assuming gender, but I think it's a pretty safe assumption in general. I've also looked a little bit at the subtitles of the article, and it does also mention sleepwalking. So it's not only about DID, but I'm hoping that we can get some insight into how dissociative identity disorder was recognized and treated in 1901, just because that is something that I don't know anything about. So let's find out what they have to say. Within the past 15 years, many of the unusual actions of the mind have been very diligently and intelligently observed and studied. 15 years, huh? So they're saying ever since 1885. Leave a comment below if you know more about that. And one of the things that has been learned is that the conscious, everyday, working mind is not all there is of mind. There is another part which often shows itself and works independently of our ordinary conscious personality, and constitutes what we call a second personality. This second personality is now the subject of much scientific interest and study. Okay, what? Okay, there's another part which often shows itself and works independently of our ordinary conscious personality, and constitutes what we call a second personality. Okay, so it's not about DID? Okay, I have no idea what it's about then. Okay. One of the first cases to attract serious attention of medical men and psychologists was that of Felida X, reported by Dr. Azam of Bordeaux in France. She was a nervous, moody, sickly, indolent child, given to attacks of ill temper, which, when she was about 14 years of age, became hysterical, and sometimes even of a serious epileptiform character. So she had seizures. That's great. When she came out of one of the more serious attacks, it was noticed on one occasion that she came into an entirely new and unusual condition. Her general appearance was quite changed, and while she talked and acted as if thoroughly awake, it was in a manner entirely different from her usual self. Oh, that does sound like DID. Interesting. I wonder what was wrong with her. She had seizures, and it sounds like maybe some oppositional defiance, but I'm not sure. At first it was thought to be an attack of sleepwalking, but it lasted only a few minutes, and then she came back to her usual consciousness again. It was thought to be an attack of sleepwalking. Is that why they're talking about sleepwalking? Okay, I'm confused. Other attacks followed, at first only of short duration, but gradually increasing until they came to occupy hours and even days at a time. In her ordinary state, she had no remembrance of what occurred in the second condition, but the whole time she was in that condition was to her a blank. On the other hand, all the different occasions on which this second personality appeared were connected with memory, forming an entirely distinct and separate life. Another consciousness, just as complete and conspicuous as her original and primary life and consciousness. Yeah, it does sound like DID, doesn't it? So the two lines went along at first parallel, but quite separate and distinct. Two personalities, and curiously enough, entirely different in character and disposition. The original self would be sick, indolent, and melancholy, ill-tempered, and unhappy. The new one would be in excellent health, was troubled with no epileptic attacks, but was bright, industrious, and cheerful. Interesting. At first, these two personalities understood nothing of their relations to each other. Number one absolutely knew nothing whatever of the second personality, and the time occupied by number two was a blank to number one. Number two, however, knew of number one, but only as an entirely distinct person having no special relation with herself. This situation of mutual ignorance of each other could not continue, for each in turn made changes in the household arrangements which would be recognized and wondered at by the other when she again became the ruling personality. Thus, their relations came to be in a measure understood, especially by the second personality. At length, the second personality came to occupy nearly the whole time, and considered herself the real, normal, dominant self, as indeed she was, being superior to the original self in every way, in health, intellectual capacity, industry, and moral worth. She knew very well the miserable and unhappy condition of the primary self, and really pitied her and did what she could to assist her, but she disliked her, as did everyone else, and dreaded her return. She called her the stupid one, and when she had warning of her appearance, she would write a note, and place it where it would be found by her, explaining the condition of affairs in the house, whom she might expect to meet, and giving advice regarding matters to be done. Interesting. She wrote notes to herself? So number 2 became the normal, recognized, efficient personality. She married, brought up children, and successfully carried on the business of a shop, interrupted only at long intervals and for brief periods by the appearance of number 1. Wow, this is so fascinating to me. Okay, now they're going to go on to the next case study. But that is... Okay, I knew I would have to do this, but I have to look up DID and like the symptoms of it. Thank you, Google, for not making me spell everything correctly. Okay. It's not disassociative, it's dissociative. That's my problem, okay. Now, this article I'm reading from is from the Mayo Clinic, so I think that's a pretty good, source of information. So, dissociative disorders are mental disorders that involve experiencing a disconnection and lack of continuity between thoughts, memories, surroundings, actions, and identity. People with dissociative disorders escape reality in ways that are involuntary and unhealthy and cause problems with functioning in everyday life. Dissociative disorders usually develop as a result to trauma and help keep difficult memories at bay. Symptoms ranging from amnesia to alternate identities depend part on the type of dissociative disorder you have. Times of stress can temporarily worsen symptoms, making them more obvious. Treatment for dissociative disorders may include talk therapy, psychotherapy, and medication. Although treating dissociative disorders can be difficult, many people learn new ways of coping and lead healthy, productive lives. Symptoms. Signs and symptoms depend on the type of dissociative disorders you have, but may include memory loss, and she definitely had that one, amnesia of certain time periods, events, people, and personal information, a sense of being detached from yourself and your emotions. She also mentioned that, yeah. A perception of the people and things around you as distorted and unreal. No, that's not what she had. A blurred sense of identity. That's definitely true. Significant stress or problems in your relationship, work, or other important areas of your life. So that's subjective stress, yeah. Inability to cope well with emotional or professional stress. Mental health problems such as depression, anxiety, and suicidal thoughts and behaviors. Okay, so I'm going to skip through dissociative amnesia, dissociative identity disorder, and depersonalization derealization disorder. So I'm going to read dissociative identity disorder. Formerly known as multiple personality disorder, this disorder is characterized by switching to alternate identities. You may feel the presence of 2 or more people talking or living inside your head, and you may feel as though you're possessed by other identities. Each identity may have a unique name, personal history, and characteristics, including obvious differences in voice, gender, mannerisms, and even such physical qualities as the need for eyeglasses. They mentioned her physical changes were the seizures that she had. Yeah, she only had them with one personality, but not the other. There are also differences in how familiar each identity is with the others. People with dissociative identity disorder typically also have dissociative amnesia and often have dissociative fugue. Interesting. Causes. Dissociative disorders usually develop as a way to cope with trauma. The disorders most often form in children subject to long-term physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, or less often a home environment that's frightening or highly unpredictable. The stress of war or natural disasters can also bring on dissociative disorders. Personal identity is still forming during childhood, so a child is more able than an adult to step outside of himself or herself and observe trauma as though it's happening to a different person. A child who learns to dissociate in order to endure a traumatic experience may use this coping mechanism in response to stressful situations throughout life. So it sounds like this person had some sort of trauma, they don't mention what, and when they were about 14, they started splitting their personality so that they have, when they're in the one state, that's their trauma-filled, like, broken person, that has problems, that has epilepsy, that has issues, and they just didn't want that for themselves. So they created a whole nother person. It's interesting that the brain is able to do that, but shocking that it's necessary. Yeah. So I feel bad for this person, but it definitely sounds like she had dissociative identity disorder. Sorry, I was mispronouncing it. So, moving on. Next case study. In 1887, Ansel Bourne of Rhode Island had a most remarkable episode in his life. As a young man, he was a carpenter by trade, a good talker, and an atheist. After going through a wonderful psychic experience, including a period in which he was deaf, dumb, blind, and paralyzed, he was at length marvelously restored, experienced a change in his religious sentiments, and became an evangelist. On January 17th, while transacting some business in Providence, all of his past life seemed to slip suddenly from his memory, and an entirely new consciousness came to him. Acting upon the impulses of this new consciousness, or personality, he went to Boston, and from there to New York, then to Philadelphia, and finally to Norristown, in Pennsylvania, about 17 miles from Philadelphia, where he opened a small shop for the sale of stationery, confectionery, and miscellaneous articles. In this business he was known as A.J. Brown. He lived in a room partitioned off from his shop for that purpose, preparing his own food and eating and sleeping there. His landlord's name was Earl, and he also, with his family, lived in the same building. Mr. Brown seemed to conduct his business on very good general principles. He went back and forth to Philadelphia to replenish his stock and acted in every way as if quite accustomed to his work. On Sunday, March 13th, nearly 2 months from the time he left Rhode Island, he went to church, and at night went to bed as usual in his little room back of the shop. On Monday morning, March 14th, he awoke and found himself in what seemed to be an entirely new and strange place. He was greatly perplexed, having no idea how he came there. Thinking it possible that he might have broken into the place while asleep, he was troubled, lest he should be arrested as a burglar. Finally, after 2 hours of great agitation, he got up to explore his surroundings. He found everything strange, and the door locked on the inside. He went out into the hall, and hearing someone in the opposite room, he rapped on the door. His landlord, Mr. Earl, opened and said, "Good morning, Mr. Brown." "Where am I?" said Mr. Brown. "You all right?" replied Mr. Earl. "I'm all wrong, and my name is not Brown. Where am I?" "You're in Norristown." "Where is Norristown?" "In Pennsylvania, 17 miles from Philadelphia." "What day of the month is it?" "The 14th of March," replied Mr. Earl. "Does time go backward here? When I left home it was the 17th of January." Mr. Earl thought Mr. Brown was out of his mind, and he sent for a physician. To the doctor, Mr. Brown said his name was Ansel Bourne, and that he remembered seeing the Adams Express wagons on Dorrance Street in Providence on January 17th, and remembered nothing since until he awoke at Norristown on the 14th of March. That sounds like a fugue state, yeah? It's interesting, but it's really rare. Like, it's crazy that people experience these things. I would say that is dissociative amnesia. Yeah, the main symptom is memory loss that's more severe than normal forgetfulness and can't be explained by a medical condition. You can't recall information about yourself or events and people in your life, especially from a traumatic time. Dissociative amnesia can be specific to events in a certain time, such as intense combat, or more rarely can involve complete loss of memory about yourself. It may sometimes involve travel or confused wandering away from your life, dissociative fugue. An episode of amnesia usually occurs suddenly and may last minutes, hours, or rarely months or years. That's really crazy, but that's the same kind of risk factors and causes as DID, dissociative identity disorder. So that's interesting. So that they put those together even in 1901 and said these are related to each other, even though they didn't know exactly what was causing them and they didn't know that much about them. They did recognize that there's a dissociation, that they aren't putting things together the way they should. That's interesting. I'm going to look up fugue state really quick. Dissociative fugue is a temporary state where a person has memory loss, amnesia, and ends up in an unexpected place. People with this symptom can't remember who they are or details about their past. Other names for this include a fugue or a fugue state. Dissociative fugue. And this is from clevelandclinic.org. So, dissociative fugue is a temporary state where a person has memory loss and ends up in an unexpected place. People with this symptom, I just read that, sorry. This fugue is a symptom of dissociative disorders. Before that, experts consider this symptom a separate condition. It doesn't sound like it, though, like it's in the same article. The term fugue comes from a Latin word for fleeing or running away, which is why this symptom often involves traveling or wandering. People who experience a fugue state usually can't recognize gaps in their memory until they have evidence that they can't remember something. People with this symptom can unintentionally travel to specific locations or wander. Often they'll come out of the fugue state and feel confused because they don't remember how they got to where they are. Fugue states can be as short as a few hours or can last for days or even months. When fugue states are shorter, it's harder for others to see signs of them, as people with this might look like they're late or absent from their usual comings and goings. When fugue states are longer, people can find themselves far away from their usual surroundings. They might try to take on a new identity and build a new life for themselves, which can last until their memories return. So yeah, that's exactly what happened to this person. Like, that's crazy. Like, it's just crazy to think about. It just, like, wow. Can you imagine you get on a train one day and you end up in another city and you just build a new life? Like your other one never existed. I wonder why our brain does that. It's very, very strange. All right. Next section is called The Original Personality Came Back. So are we still talking about Ansel Bourne? Yes. Ansel Bourne's friends in Rhode Island were notified. They came on and settled up his business in Norristown, and the former A.J. Brown returned to Rhode Island as Ansel Bourne and resumed his former life there. Well, I had the same initials. That's interesting. But at the time from January 17th to March 14th, he had no recollection. It was all a blank. Subsequently, on 2 or 3 occasions and for very short periods, the second condition or personality returned, and he was again A.J. Brown. Then all the events of the period during which the second personality was dominant, the A.J. Brown period, were perfectly in his memory, and gave all the particulars of his journey to Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and Norristown, the incidents of the journey, and the hotels and boarding houses at which he stops. These were all subsequently verified. All the business transaction at Norristown, his church, and his religious life there were all clear and distinct in his mind up to the morning of March 14th, when that epoch of his life again abruptly closed. While in this condition, his wife, with whom he had been talking a few minutes before, was introduced. He said he had an indistinct remembrance of her, and also of Ansel Bourne, but he scoffed at the suggestion that she was or ever had been his wife. Immediately, on resuming his ordinary consciousness, he was Ansel Bourne, with his normal train of thought and memories, and all of his former interests, beliefs, and affections. But of A.J. Brown or his doings he had no knowledge whatsoever. These are cases where 2 distinct personalities existed and worked side by side, alternating in their periods of dominance, sometimes frequently and sometimes at long intervals. Cases have been observed, however, where more than 2 personalities are found to exist, and we know that from DID, Man of 4 distinct personalities. In the case of Louis V., reported by Dr. Voisin of Paris, 4 personalities were distinctly differentiated. 1. He was an ordinary, quiet, well-behaved, healthy, obedient boy. 2. At the age of 14, on account of a terrible fright from a viper, a new personality appeared, of which the primary self had no knowledge. In that state, he was an epileptic, but was able to work, and he learned the trade of a tailor. 3. After an epileptic attack of unusual violence or a quick succession of attacks lasting 50 hours, horrible, another personality came to the front, a greedy, violent, quarrelsome, drunken, thievish vagabond, paralyzed on one side and having an impediment in his speech. He was an atheist, an anarchist, and a blackguard, always ranting and thrusting his opinions upon those about him, perpetrating execrable jokes on his physicians and attendants. In this state he knew nothing of the tailor's trade, but was private of Marines. 4, he was a quiet, sensible man, retiring in behavior and modest in speech. If asked his opinion upon politics or religion, he bashfully replied that he would rather leave such questions to wiser heads than his. In this condition he had no paralysis, nor impediment in his speech. As a man 40 years of age, he returned to the condition of childhood previous to his fright, a child in intellect and knowledge, having no occupation, an ordinary, well-behaved boy. Wow, that's crazy. That is just amazing to me. And I can't explain it. I'm not a doctor, but I don't even think doctors can explain it really. But and how the physical manifestations changed. In one personality he had seizures, and in the others he didn't. And in one he was paralyzed on one half of his body, and in another he wasn't. I don't understand how that happens. I don't understand how that works. Because if you're paralyzed on one half of your body, that's brain damage, yeah? That's damage to one half of your brain. How is it possible that can just switch? That's so amazing to me. Okay, one of the strangest cases ever known. I don't know if we're still in dissociative disorders or if we have moved on to sleepwalking. All right. In the cases so far described, the second or any subsequent personalities which may appear have not exhibited any marked superiority over the primary one. I disagree. The first one did. Yeah? Because the first one, the woman was basically non-functioning with her primary personality, and then the secondary came in and she was all over everything. She was very capable. Yeah? Very competent. So I disagree with this. But hey, I'm not a doctor, so maybe they're talking about physical superiority. They may be better physically, intelligently, or morally, and they generally are so, but sometimes, as once in the case of Louis V., they may be decidedly worse. There is, however, another class of cases where interesting physical phenomena appear in connection with the different personalities, indicating the presence of superior perceptive faculties, and showing the influence which the secondary personality often exists over the primary. In the case of Alma Z is an instance of this kind. In this case, an unusually healthy, intellectual, conscientious girl, on account of overwork and care, broke down completely when 20 years of age, and a second and finally a third personality appeared and continued several years, varying as to frequency and the length of time occupied, until, with confirmed health, the primary self again reigned securely as the dominant personality. As usual in these cases, the primary self knew nothing of the succeeding personalities, but number 2 knew number 1 very well, though reckoning her as a person directly distinct from herself. She greatly admired number 1, and was always completely devoted to her welfare. The same was also true of number 3. They were both admirers of number 1 on account of her superior knowledge, her splendid character, and unmistakable power. This case has been under my observation for many years, and in addition to its typical character as regards distinct personalities, it illustrates the fact of the persistence of the latter personality with the ability to observe, retain its chain of memories, and to report them, while the primary self is at the same time the dominant and active personality. But I don't see that as hugely different than the first one. It's just that they all admired the first personality and recognized themselves as less than, whereas in the first case we discussed, there was the second personality had a lot of contempt for the first and was very frustrated by them. So I don't see that as hugely different though, because it's just a different emotion attached to it, but there's still an emotion attached to it. So I don't know. That's just my opinion. Of course, we need some mental health professionals here to correct us, yeah? So if you are a mental health professional, please leave your comments below. I am interested. Her other self came to the concert. An interest of this occurred at one of the concerts of a distinguished pianist several years ago. Number 3 was the reigning personality. Beethoven's Concerto in C major was on the program, and was being delightfully rendered by both soloist and orchestra. I happened to be sitting near her in the box when all at once I noticed a change in the expression of her face, which denoted the presence of number 1. She listened to the performance with intense interest and pleasure, and at its close I spoke to her of the treat we were enjoying, and she replied in her usual intelligent and charming manner. It was number 1 without the possibility of mistake. Presently, she leaned back in her chair, took 2 or 3 quick inspirations, her face changed again, and number 3 was present once more. She turned to me smiling and said, "So number 1 came for her favorite concerto. Wasn't it splendid that she could hear it?" I said, "Yes, but how did you know she was here?" "Oh, I sat on the front of the box. I heard the music too, and I saw you speak to her." Oh, that's a different one. Like, that was also mentioned in the articles I was looking at. Hang on. It was the... sorry. Where's my article? It is the Mayo Clinic article. It was depersonalization derealization disorder. This involves an ongoing or episodic sense of detachment, of being outside of yourself, observing your actions, feelings, thoughts, and self from a distance as though watching a movie. Depersonalization. Other people and things around you may feel detached and foggy or dreamlike. Time may be slowed down or sped up, and the world may seem unreal. Derealization. You may experience depersonalization, derealization, or both. Symptoms, which can be profoundly distressing, may only last a few moments or come and go over many years. So it sounds like she also had that, symptoms of that as well. That's just crazy to me. I'm sorry I keep saying the word crazy. I'm not trying to make a comment on the people. It's just the disorder itself I find crazy. It's just, wow. Amazing. The presence of number 2 especially always meant strength, power of endurance, and ability to accomplish things which would otherwise have been impossible for the original personality, and so with the assistance of number 2, she was often able to attend places of amusement. Being made comfortable in her place, number 1 would appear and enjoy the performance without the fatigue which otherwise would have barred her from the pleasure. On one occasion, having been brought by number 2 to an opera which she had especially desired to hear, Siegfried, or perhaps Lohengrin, and installed in her place, she would suddenly find herself in her normal personality, ready to enjoy the opening scene. Becoming passive and absorbed in the music and the action of the opera, presently above the actual stage there would appear another stage, with the same opera being performed simultaneously and in harmony with the one on the real stage. Only the actual performance had the usual imperfections, whereas the one on the visionary stage seemed in music and action to represent the ideal of the composer while creating the work. The rendering on the real stage appeared crude and commonplace compared with the truer, ideal representation going on just above it. Wow. That's interesting. I wonder why they do that. I wonder why people do this. It makes sense to me to a certain extent. I have to say that. Because people who have been abused their brain tries every way possible to make sense of what's going on and to protect their own brain against damage by allowing them to process this. So a lot of times these memories get pushed down, they get suppressed to an extreme. So I understand principally why you would want to do this, because then if you're in your other personality, then you don't remember all that you don't have to remember what happened to you. You're giving yourself permission to live a different life that's different than the one you're already living, that doesn't include the trauma. And so I understand that part of it. I just think it's fascinating that a brain can do this. Obviously it's not very common, but like when it does happen, it's just shocking. It's shocking. A composer's life strangely revealed. Representations of composers and their surroundings sometimes occurred under similar circumstances. On the occasion of the first production of Tchaikovsky's Pathetic Pathetic Symphony in New York in March 1894, this girl was present. The symphony was entirely new to her, and she knew absolutely nothing of the composer. On this occasion, the front of the visionary stage above the real stage, upon which the orchestra was seated, was occupied during the first movement by a beautiful landscape with trees and foliage and open spaces, in which were conspicuous the graceful forms of women and youths, all thinly veiled, going through evolutions of graceful and appropriate dances, moving and swaying in time and cadence with the music. At the back of the stage, and somewhat raised above it, an open space, was the composer, Tchaikovsky, in negligee costume, reclining on a divan, smoking a long pipe, enjoying the performance and often approving the work of the conductor. During the second movements, which she characterized as aimless and lacking inspiration, the stage was occupied by a cold, rocky, and dreary scene, with only one person appearing in it, and he wandering about as if seeking a way out, going this way and that, but without result. Tchaikovsky was in the same position, but appearing troubled, without repose or enjoyment of expression in either face or posture. Partly beneath him and out of his line of sight was sitting a woman, rather handsome, not refined, cynical, hard, looking upward in the direction of the composer with a disagreeable, unsympathetic smile. From this vision and her impressions, Alma Z. ventured the opinion that Tchaikovsky, while composing this movement, and perhaps also the third, was subject to an evil influence, which was in some manner connected with this woman, or of which this woman was symbolical, and which greatly interfered both intellectually and inspirationally in his work. She has never had the slightest indication that such was the case other than by this vision. This sketch was written directly after the performance in March 1894. On September 1st, 1894, 6 months later, the following appeared in the New York Evening Post. When Tchaikovsky died, it was not generally known that he was married. In his will, however, he left a small annuity to his widow, to whom he was married in 1877. It was soon, however, found out that their tempers were not congenial, so they agreed to a separation. The same idea was often carried out in the other forms of art, as, for example, in painting, and the occasions upon which this occurred were beyond her will or control. Wow! So, today we would consider that kind of a psychic connection, that people are very sensitive and they get these impressions about people just based on their work. That's really, really amazing. Sleepwalking is just as puzzling. I disagree. I don't think sleepwalking is that puzzling. It's a little weird. It's a little weird, but I don't consider it nearly as puzzling as dissociative disorders. Conditions like those I have detailed here attracted attention and began to be more carefully studied by psychologists. They saw that there was a certain similarity in the cases observed. In each case, the usual primary personality was submerged. It disappeared below the range of consciousness, and another personality, distinct and new, emerged, and for the time being became the conscious, dominating self. Sometimes these personalities alternated at short intervals, and sometimes the second personality was persistent for months or even years. Sometimes also the subliminal self only impressed the primary self without coming into full control. The second personalities were generally just as sound, and understood their relations to other people and to their surroundings just as well as the primary self, and sometimes a great deal better, like the first woman. Sleepwalking has always been just as much of a puzzle as double personality, and as double personality was when it was first observed. Nobody could give any satisfactory explanation. The case noticed by the Archbishop of Bordeaux and published in the great French encyclopedia was among the first well-observed cases and attracted a great deal of attention. But it remained a mystery. A young ecclesiastic in the seminary with the Archbishop was in the habit of getting up at night in a condition of somnambulism, going to his study and composing and writing his sermons in the dark. When he had finished one page, he read it over and carefully and properly corrected it. A broad piece of cardboard interposed between his eyes and his writing made no difference to him. He wrote, read, and corrected just the same as if there had been no obstruction. Having completed his work to his satisfaction, he returned to bed, and in the morning had not the slightest idea of what he had done in the night, and had no knowledge of it until he saw the manuscript in his own handwriting. That's crazy. Thomas Carlyle relates concerning his wife Jane Welsh Carlyle that as a child she was an excellent mathematician. One afternoon she was for hours hard at work at a problem in algebra, but without success. At night, however, in her sleep, she arose, went to her desk, solved the problem, left it in her desk, and then went back to bed. In the morning, much to her surprise, she found her problem carefully worked out in her own handwriting. Alright, sleepwalking. Okay, sleepwalking is when someone walks or carries out complex activities while not fully awake. It usually happens during a period of deep sleep. This peaks during the early part of the night, so sleepwalking tends to happen in the first few hours after falling asleep. So this is an article from the nhs.uk. Sleepwalking can start at any age, but is more common in children. It's thought that 1 in 5 children will sleepwalk at least once. Most grow out of it by the time they reach puberty, but it can sometimes persist into adulthood. Why some people sleepwalk? The exact cause of sleepwalking is unknown, but it seems to run in families. You're more likely to sleepwalk if other members of your close family have or had sleepwalking behaviors or night terrors. The following things can trigger sleepwalking or make it worse: not getting enough sleep, stress and anxiety, infection with a high temperature, especially in children, drinking too much alcohol, hopefully not in children, taking drugs, certain types of medicine such as some sedatives, being startled by a sudden noise or touch, causing abrupt waking from a deep sleep, waking up suddenly from deep sleep because you need to go to the toilet. Okay, that makes sense. So you're in this deep sleep state and you're suddenly woken up from it, then you might not be completely awake. That's basically what they're saying. I've seen this in my own children. I have a daughter who just turned 6, and sometimes she'll fall asleep in front of the TV in the evening, which I actually think is very funny. But she's getting too heavy to carry around, you know? I mean, you get to that point where you're like, oh, honey, I'm not going to carry you. So I kind of help her to her feet, yeah? And I steer her towards her bed and then help her to lay down. And she very rarely remembers that the next day. She'll just go straight to sleep. And I don't feel like I've woken her completely. Like, I don't think she's awake. But she is walking on her own 2 feet, so I don't have to carry her. So, but I wouldn't call that sleepwalking because she doesn't do it on her own. You know, I'm the one kind of helping her up to walk and then go back to sleep, where I'm not fully waking her up either. So I'm guessing that would fall under this category of being startled by a sudden noise or touch, causing abrupt waking from a deep sleep. So, but once again, I wouldn't call it sleepwalking because she wouldn't do it on her own. What happens when a person sleepwalks? In some episodes of sleepwalking, a person may just sit up in bed and look around, briefly appearing confused. Others may get out of bed and walk about, open cupboards, get dressed, or eat, and they may appear agitated. In extreme cases, the person may walk out of the house and carry out complex activities such as driving a car. That's terrifying. The eyes are usually open when someone is sleepwalking, although the person will look straight through people and not recognize them. They can often move well around familiar objects. If you talk to a person who is sleepwalking, they may partially respond or say things that do not make sense. Most sleepwalking episodes last less than 10 minutes, but they can be longer. At the end of each episode, the person may wake up or return to bed and go to sleep. They will not normally have any memory of it in the morning or may have patchy memory. If woken while sleepwalking, a person may feel confused and not remember what happened. Right, treatments, I'm not interested in that at the moment. That's fascinating though, but I wouldn't call it another personality, and I don't feel like it's related to the other dissociative disorders. So, I'm just saying. But they're mentioning it as if it were related, so. Alright, somnambulist. Somnambulism, it means sleepwalking, yes. Somna meaning sleep, and then ambulatory, being movement. Remarkable feats of a somnambulist. An interesting case of somnambulism is reported by M. Bader, director of the Normal School at Blois. It is accredited by Dr. Dufay and printed in the Proceedings of the Society for Psychical Research. Théophile Janicot was a pupil at the Normal School, and in the month of July of his second year, he commenced to walk in his sleep. He not only walked about the dormitory, but he also went to his study and worked at his lessons in the dark, or amused himself in the garden, examining and picking flowers, sometimes for hours at a time. Then, without waking, he would return to his bed, and in the morning knew nothing of these occurrences. One night, notwithstanding careful watching, Janicot left the dormitory without being noticed. The next morning he was in bed, but his pillow and watch were missing. It was at once surmised that he had been out during the night, and search was made all through the buildings in the garden for the missing articles, but without success. At last, something white was observed on the zinc roof of the infirmary, and on inspection it proved to be Janicot's pillow, which he had put there in the night, and with his watch and a bunch of flowers which he had gathered from the garden. It was a perilous route, which the somnambulist must have taken both in ascending and descending, one which he would never have dared to attempt in his waking state. These nocturnal expeditions became so frequent and perilous that it was necessary to secure him by padlock and chain. But even this was not always sufficient, for he managed to get his hand through his wristlets, and on one occasion he cut a piece of wood from the window casing, and from it modelled a key with his knife, which he undid the lock all in his sleep and made his escape. That's so crazy. Wow. Like, if somebody gave me a chunk of wood and a knife and said, make a key, I don't think I could do it. Because keys are quite complex and you'd have to, make it very carefully. But to do that in your sleep just to get out of your restraints, like, that is just insane. Once again, I'm not calling the person insane. I'm calling the situation insane. That's just crazy. Walked in perilous places as he slept. Monsieur Badeau's father-in-law lived at Vendôme, and his little son was there with his grandparents. One evening, about 11 o'clock, Janicot, having escaped from his dormitory, came to Monsieur Badeau's bedroom door and knocked. "I have just arrived," he said, "from Vendôme, and have come to bring you news of your family. Monsieur and Mademoiselle Arnaud are well, and your little son has 4 teeth." "As you have seen them at Vendôme," suggested Monsieur Badea, "perhaps you could go back and tell me where they are now." "Wait," said Janicot, "I am there. They are sleeping in a room on the first floor. Their bed is at the farther end of the room on the left. The nurse's bed is on the right, and Henry's cradle is next to it." I wonder if that was true. They didn't mention if it was true or not. Okay, so, sorry. He forgets his sleepwalking when awake. When awake, Janicot had no recollection of anything that he had said or done in his sleepwalking state, but in each attack he remembers perfectly all that occurred in the preceding ones. In short, in somnambulism, we have a direct parallel to the condition of double personality as described in the first part of the article, as seen in many somnambulists. However, there is a peculiar perceptive power making both physical and mental faculties more direct and certain in their action, and even adding certain powers of perception. These, on account of their rarity, we call supernatural. Yeah, this last paragraph I just do not agree with at all. I don't think it's supernatural, and I don't think that it is related to dissociative disorders, This double personality, then, which we have been considering, is no form of insanity, as has sometimes been supposed, and while we may call it supernormal in the sense that it is unusual, it is by no means supernatural. It is a part of the human mind, a wonderfully interesting part, and one which we are just beginning to learn something about. It is called by various names: the second personality or consciousness, the subconscious mind, and the subliminal self. Yeah, but those are different things, now aren't they? I don't know about subliminal self, but like the subconscious mind and your second personality or consciousness, like those are different things. So, interesting though that he was putting that together, and I do appreciate that the author is trying very hard to get rid of the stigma against multiple personalities. And then there's the photo I hopefully showed you before. If I haven't, then I'll show it to you now. It has a caption that says, "Above the real stage on a visionary stage, she saw Tchaikovsky reclining on a divan, enjoying the performance." So, this was the woman who saw like 2 performances at once. So these are very interesting case studies for me, but I don't think they're all related, Some of them are related to each other, but like dissociative identity disorder, the ones that had multiple personalities, like literally, I feel like those all had the same condition, whereas the man in the fugue state, I think that's a different thing. And I also think that the sleepwalking is not related to it. But let me Google that real quick. Is sleepwalking related to dissociative disorders? I still can't spell dissociative. Okay. Enduring and conscientious hypothesis that sleepwalking and night terrors is symptomatic of a protective dissociative mechanism is examined. Oh, this is PMJ. These are like articles. These are like scholarly articles. And since I know that they're not going to let me see it, so I'm going to try. And this one is from PubMed NCBI NLM NIH.gov, which I think is British. I'm not 100% sure. National Library of Medicine. Is there a dissociative process in sleepwalking and night terrors? So the abstract is quite long. Let me see if I can kind of skim it. In a group of 22 adult patients referred to a tertiary sleep disorder service with possible sleepwalking or night terrors, diagnosis was confirmed both clinically and polysomnographically. And oh, sorry, I'm not a doctor, can you tell? And only 6 patients had a history of such trauma. Trauma? What trauma? Major psychological trauma. Okay, sorry. That's what happens when you don't read every sentence. Here we go. So, 2 such cases suggested of a dissociative process are described in more detail. The results of this study are presented largely on account of the negative findings. Scores on the dissociative questionnaire were normal, although generally higher in the small trauma subgroup. These were similar to scores characterizing individuals with post-traumatic stress disorder. Okay, that makes sense. I know if they had had trauma, then they had post-traumatic stress. Yeah, this trauma group also scored particularly high on the anxiety, phobic, and depressive disorders on the Crown-Crisp experiential index. The contrast to the no trauma group scored more specifically highly on the anxiety scale, along with major trends to high depression and hysteria scale scores. 2 cases are presented which illustrate exceptional occurrences of later inset of sleepwalking night terrors with accompanying post-traumatic symptoms during wakefulness. It is concluded that a history of major psychological trauma exists in only a minority of adult patients presenting with sleepwalking night terror syndrome. In this subgroup, trauma appears to dictate the subsequent content of the attacks. However, the symptoms express themselves within the form of sleepwalking night terror syndrome rather than as rapid eye movement sleep-related nightmares. Okay. The main group of subjects with the syndrome with no history of major psychological trauma show no clinical or DISQ evidence of dissociation during wakefulness. The proposition that within the character structure of this group, the mechanism still operates, but exclusively within sleep, remains a possibility. So they didn't have any major conclusions from this experiment. But at the same time, they were able to show that the trauma group was showing more signs of post-traumatic stress than they were signs of dissociative disorders. So, like, post-traumatic stress is very conscious. Like, we're aware we have it, yeah? Although there might be moments of dissociation attached to post-traumatic stress, like where you have flashbacks and you think you're still there in the middle of your trauma, but I don't think that that's typical. I think that most people are aware that they have post-traumatic stress and they're just overly reacting too strongly to something that happened because of their experience of the past, their traumatic event. So obviously, not being a medical professional and not being anyone in the mental health field, I can't really comment on the conclusions that anyone's making. But I do find this absolutely fascinating, and I hadn't heard that there is a connection between dissociative disorders and sleepwalking, although I think that according to this article they did not find that, but they left it open to the possibility that there might be evidence in the future. So they're not saying that it definitely doesn't, they're saying they haven't found evidence of it. So, I mean, those are 2 completely different things. So I will say that it appears that the most recent findings are that they have not found a connection between dissociative disorders and sleepwalking. But that doesn't mean that there isn't one, that just means they haven't found one yet. But that's just what they think of so far. I can see why they would equate them because of the amnesia aspect, but I don't think that they're as closely related as this doctor who wrote this article thinks that they are closely related. All right, I found that absolutely fascinating, and this has been a long one, so I'm going to stop it there. But leave a like on the video if you found that as fascinating as I did, and subscribe to the channel. I really love medical articles, and especially things that we know a lot more about today than we knew about then, because I love to see the perspective of the people who were studying it back in the day, because it's so fascinating, and all of their observations, regardless of how difficult it was to make those observations, I think is very impressive that they actually take that time to really look into it. So leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.